Imagine a country where a loaf of bread costs $1.6 trillion. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. It's the shocking reality of Zimbabwe in 2008. This African nation, once known as the breadbasket of the continent, was now a living testament to an economy in ruins. In the year that followed, Zimbabwe's economy spiraled dramatically downward. By 2009, the situation was nothing short of a catastrophe. Schools were in disarray, functioning sporadically, if at all. Prolonged blackouts became the norm, with electricity a luxury few could afford. But the most telling sign of the economic collapse was the staggering unemployment rate. 94% of the population was jobless. Almost every family had a tale of hardship to tell. The bustling streets of Harare, once filled with the hustle and bustle of trade, were now predominantly home to desperate job seekers. The root cause of this economic devastation? Hyperinflation. In simple terms, hyperinflation is when the prices of goods and services rise so rapidly that the local currency becomes essentially worthless. In Zimbabwe's case, the rate of hyperinflation reached an almost unfathomable peak. We're talking about an inflation rate of 89.7 sextillion %. To put that in perspective, it's a number with 21 zeros. Picture this: 1 minute, you could buy a loaf of bread with a $100 bill. The next, that same bill wouldn't even get you a slice. That's how quickly the value of money was plummeting. The government was literally printing money, but each new note was worth less than the paper it was printed on. This was a nation in freefall, a stark example of how economic mismanagement can lead to catastrophe. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the roots of this crisis and explore how Zimbabwe, once a beacon of hope in Africa, became a cautionary tale for the world. To understand how Zimbabwe got to this point, we must travel back in time to when the country was known as Southern Rhodesia. Southern Rhodesia, as it was known, had adopted a development strategy that heavily emphasized European migration and the enrichment of a white elite. This approach indeed led to an economic boom, but it was a prosperity that came at a high cost. The black majority population was systematically oppressed, with their rights and opportunities severely curtailed. This socio-economic imbalance was a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. In the mid-20th century, Southern Rhodesia defied the world with a unilateral declaration of independence. This move was a desperate attempt by the white minority government to maintain its grip on power. However, it led to the imposition of international sanctions, plunging the nation into a deep economic crisis. The isolation from the global community triggered a 15-year conflict that would forever change the course of the nation's history. This violent struggle, marked by guerrilla warfare and political assassinations, culminated in the birth of Zimbabwe. After independence, Zimbabwe initially showed promise. There were significant improvements in education and healthcare, and the nation seemed poised for a brighter future. But beneath the surface, the roots of a crisis were festering. Political violence, rampant corruption, and economic mismanagement began to undermine the fledgling nation. Land reforms intended to redress the injustices of the past led to a chaotic land grab. This resulted in the collapse of the agricultural sector, which had once been the backbone of the economy. Food shortages became commonplace, and the nation was plunged into economic turmoil. To fund government expenses, Zimbabwe resorted to the printing of money. This reckless strategy unleashed hyperinflation, causing widespread economic devastation. The country's economy, once vibrant and promising, was now in ruins. The seeds of economic disaster were sown during these turbulent times. These were the roots of the crisis that would lead Zimbabwe to become the worst economy to ever exist. In the years following independence, Zimbabwe showed promise, but it wasn't to last. As a newly independent nation, Zimbabwe began to make strides in improving the lives of its citizens. Education and healthcare systems saw a significant boost. School enrollment increased, literacy rates skyrocketed, and access to healthcare services expanded. It was a hopeful time, an era of potential and promise. But beneath this surface of progress, the seeds of discord were being sown. Political violence was a haunting spectre never far from the daily lives of the people. Corruption began to infest the corridors of power, with the ruling elite amassing wealth while the majority of the population continued to languish in poverty. Economic mismanagement became the norm rather than the exception, with policies that were more about political expediency than sound economic principles. And then came the land reforms. On paper, the idea was noble. Redistribute land from the minority white farmers to the majority black population. But in practice, it was a different story. The process was chaotic, marred by violence and lawlessness. The beneficiaries of the land reform were often political cronies with little to no experience in farming. As a result, agricultural productivity plummeted, turning the breadbasket of Africa into a nation dependent on food aid. This collapse of the agricultural sector had far-reaching impacts on the economy. With the agricultural sector in disarray, food shortages became rampant and inflation began to creep in. The government, desperate for funds to maintain its grip on power, turned to the printing press, flooding the market with money. This further fueled inflation, setting the stage for the hyperinflation that would come in the years ahead. The downward spiral had begun, and it would only get worse. The stage was set for an economic crisis of epic proportions, a crisis that would turn Zimbabwe into a case study of how not to run an economy. But as we will see in the next scene, the worst was yet to come. In a desperate attempt to fund government expenses, Zimbabwe resorted to money printing, a decision that would prove disastrous. Let's break down what unfolded. To understand hyperinflation, think of it as inflation on steroids. Inflation is when prices increase over time due to an increase in the money's supply. Hyperinflation is this process gone wild, with prices skyrocketing at an uncontrollable rate. Now, imagine going to the store and the price of bread is doubling every day. That's hyperinflation. Zimbabwe's decision to print money was like adding fuel to an already raging fire. The government was spending more than it was earning, and to make up the difference, it simply printed more money. As more money entered the economy, the value of each dollar decreased. This led to prices going up, which in turn led to the government printing even more money. It was a vicious cycle, and it spiraled out of control. The fallout was catastrophic. The country experienced hyperinflation on an almost unimaginable scale, peaking at a mind-boggling 89.7 sextillion %. That's a number with 21 zeros. Money became so worthless that people had to carry bags of cash just to buy basic necessities. Food shortages became the norm as the cost of goods soared astronomically. A loaf of bread, which cost just a few dollars at the start of the year, could cost millions by the end. People's life savings evaporated overnight, and poverty and hunger were rampant. The economic devastation was widespread. Unemployment was at a staggering 94%, and schools and hospitals were in disarray. The country was in a state of prolonged blackouts, with the government unable to provide basic services. Zimbabwe's experience with hyperinflation is a stark reminder of what can happen when economic principles are ignored and short-term solutions are prioritized over long-term stability. The economy was in ruins, but a brief ray of hope was on the horizon. A power-sharing agreement in 2009 brought a temporary halt to the economic freefall. In the eye of this storm, Zimbabwe found a glimmer of hope. The political rivals agreed to share power, and for a brief moment, the nation exhaled. The punishing hyperinflation was halted thanks to a bold move. Zimbabwe abandoned its currency, adopting a multi-currency system that included the US dollar and South African rand. The shops started filling up again, and the economy started to stabilize. But don't let this seemingly calm period fool you. The nation was still on shaky ground. The power-sharing agreement was far from perfect. It was more like a band-aid on a wound that required major surgery. It dealt with the symptoms, not the root causes of the crisis. As the dust settled, old political problems resurfaced. The power-sharing agreement was marred by disputes and political maneuvering. Corruption persisted, and without a national currency, the government struggled to control its finances. The economy remained vulnerable, dependent on foreign currencies and the whims of international markets. Additionally, the land reforms had left a long shadow. The agricultural sector, once the backbone of the economy, was still in a state of disarray. The chaotic land grab had disrupted farming, causing food shortages and leaving the nation dependent on imports and humanitarian aid. And then, in 2017, another twist. The military stepped in, and the long-standing leader was forced to resign. A new era dawned, but the nation's problems were far from over. In fact, they were just getting started. The new leader faced the daunting task of rebuilding an economy plagued by deep-seated problems. In a nutshell, Zimbabwe's brief period of stabilization was just that. Brief. It was a respite, not a solution. The country's deep-rooted issues continued to fester, keeping the economy on a knife edge. Zimbabwe's story is a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and economic mismanagement. Today, Zimbabwe continues to grapple with its economic woes. A culmination of historic inequities, political violence, corruption and mismanagement led to a catastrophic economic collapse. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and a health and education system in crisis are but a few of the harsh realities of Zimbabwe's economic journey. The story of Zimbabwe is a poignant tale of how unchecked power and economic mismanagement can lead to dire consequences. As we look at Zimbabwe, we see a nation that has endured one of the worst economic crises in history. It's a stark reminder of the importance of sound economic management and the devastating impact when it goes awry.